This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Stanford University history professor Jennifer Burns discusses her book, Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. She speaks about the life and career of economist Milton Friedman. She's interviewed by CATO Institute Vice President for Economic and Social Policy Studies, Alex Nowrasteh.
Before we get to this week's episode, we want to take a minute to ask for your help. Your financial support will ensure that C-SPAN can continue to produce podcasts that inform you about national politics, introduce you to the latest nonfiction books, and provide valuable historical context to today's news. Make a donation today and be a part of C-SPAN's future. Visit c-span.org/donate.
Your new book, Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative, is the first full biography of Milton Friedman. Let's start off with, who was Milton Friedman?
So Milton Friedman was probably best known as a famous economist. He, along with John Maynard Keynes, is one of the most influential economists in the 20th century. And he worked over the course of his career to establish an alternative to Keynesian economics and Keynesian economic policy. And he was awarded the 1976 Nobel Prize in Economics. But as I show in my book, while he's first and foremost an economist, he's much more than that. I also call him a philosopher of freedom because he articulated a vision of individual freedom, limited government, personal initiative that really became wrapped up in the 20th century conservative movement and made him really a political icon and also a household figure.
So how did Americans, though, really come to know Friedman? So I read his famous book, Capitalism and Freedom, in high school, but he was a figure on television. He had a column. How did Americans really come to know Friedman?
Well, here's what's interesting. I thought, like maybe you would imagine that, Capitalism and Freedom was the big famous book that everyone started reading. But actually, his most famous book that really gets him started as a political figure is this 800-page book of economic history that he co-authored with Anna Schwartz called A Monetary History of the United States. And in this, they tell a story of 150 years of American history through the lens of money, how much money there is in the economy, which sounds kind of dry, but then what they do in their most famous chapter, which was called The Great Contraction, is they go back and they examine the Great Depression. And you have to imagine this book comes out in the early 1960s. It's not that far away in time. People are still around who have lived through the Great Depression, say 30 years before or less. So, Friedman and Schwartz argue that the reason the Great Depression was so bad and lasted so long was because the United States lost a third of the money in circulation due to the banking crisis. And then they go on to argue that the Federal Reserve System, which was supposed to act as the lender of last resort, had not done its job and had therefore let this, crisis in the banking sector spread throughout the whole economy and create decades of misery. Now, why this is important beyond that critique of the Federal Reserve is because it feeds into this larger question about the Great Depression and about capitalism itself. And what Friedman and Schwartz are implicitly arguing is not there is a basic flaw in the capitalist system that emerged in the 1930s. Rather, they're saying we can understand this as a failure of human judgment and of state management of the economy. And therefore, we know a few things we can fix. And we need not have erected the large apparatus of policy, government agencies, policy interventions, and government support of the economy in response to the Great Depression. They basically say everyone got it wrong. So this argument comes out and it's immediately arresting. It's immediately read by policymakers, widely reviewed by academics, and is also very interesting to politicians. One of the politicians who becomes very interested in this idea is Senator Barry Goldwater, who's mounting a run for the president in 1964. So the first moment comes with the publication of this book and its broad discussion, and then Friedman signs on as an advisor to Goldwater and becomes one of the most effective spokespeople for what he calls a Goldwater view of economics.
I mean, that was quite a radical thesis at the time, wasn't it? I mean, you take a look at the dominant Keynesian models that were there at the time, the dominant paradigms in economics, and what's shocking, at least to a modern audience, I think, and especially to non-economists, is how little a role money played in our understanding of the economy before Friedman and Schwartz really came along and made it a big deal in their book. And is it fair to say that this influence, his influence and her influence, has lasted to today and still influences us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of what Friedman and Schwartz proposed seemed outlandish, and today seems common sense. You know, when they were writing the book, monetary policy was often said to be pushing on a string. It didn't really have any purchase in the economy, or money was kind of a veil that laid over actual economic activity. And their argument is subtle because they're basically saying it is true that the fundamentals of economic growth and activity have to come from other things besides the monetary system. You can't sort of goose the economy by pushing in a lot of money and have that last in any meaningful way. But monetary policy can really knock the economy off course if done badly. So there's a subtlety to their argument, but it's safe to say that when they made that, there really wasn't much focus on money at all. And we didn't have the kind of data we have today. And basically, Anna Schwartz in particular went and sort of assembled this historical series of the actual quantity of money in the economy at different points in time. And then with that 150-year lens, it really gave them a broad perspective and enabled them to make arguments that other economists, really weren't interested in or hadn't seen. And so, yes, it's a great case of two scholars kind of burrowing into an area that their field has left behind and finding something really interesting.
So I want to come back to Schwartz in a second, but Friedman became really associated with and was, I think, fair to say, like the prime mover for this new way of thinking about the economy, about macroeconomics, called monetarism, which really had a long history after him, even to today. What is monetarism, and how has it impacted the world and central banking since then?
So probably the easiest way to summarize monetarism is with a saying that Friedman loved to repeat, which is inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And so what he meant by that is inflation starts with the central bank or with the monetary authorities, and it also ends there. And this was a very different idea than those that had been held at the time. So people thought of maybe inflation is caused by labor unions asking for higher wages, and you get a wage price spiral. And Friedman's like, well, maybe that is happening, but it's only happening if you have enough money in the economy to be driving prices up such that labor unions feel they have to ask for that and have to really pressure for that. They couldn't do it themselves. In other words, if the quantity of money was fixed, there wouldn't be that elasticity to push prices up. And when he talks about inflation, he's really talking about a pervasive and consistent rise in the price level generally. So today we tend to modify inflation, by saying, oh, it's a gas price inflation or housing price inflation or wage inflation. And Friedman was really trying to go a level deeper and say, I'm not talking about specific sectors of the economy. I'm talking about a kind of pervasive trend. So what he really did was get everybody's attention on the monetary authorities and their ability to let inflation go or their ability to hem it in. And I think what jumps off both of monetarism and Friedman's later theories, which point to the role of expectations in inflation, is our whole monetary framework and model today. So the fact that the Federal Reserve is very open today, first of all, it was not in Friedman's time. It was like a secret club. They only released reports of what they had done after the fact. They didn't really tell anyone what they were talking about. And one of Friedman's insights was inflation, while it is connected to the monetary authorities, it has a pace driven by what people think is going to happen next. And so that's why you see things like forward guidance and all the communication with the Fed. The other piece of monetarism that's really important is Friedman's policy idea. And over time, he came up with what he called a monetary growth rule. And he basically said, fine, maybe we have to have the Federal Reserve. Maybe we're not ready to end the Fed, although earlier in his career he thought that might be a good idea. So if we have a Federal Reserve, they should be more accountable to Congress, and they should be more accountable to everybody by saying this is what we're going to do. And he wanted them to grow the supply of money at a fixed rate. Eventually, he said something about 4% would be good. And it needs to grow because you need to have economic growth, demographic change, expansion. You can't have a flat money supply. But if it's growing at a steady rate, everybody can make their plans and their predictions around that steady rate. And then what should happen is we should forget about monetary policy. If we do it right, we should completely forget about it. And it sort of shouldn't matter because it's background noise. And then the other factors such as innovation, productivity growth, a change over time, these should be what drives economic growth. So again, while we don't talk about a monetary growth rule per se, the sort of modifications that were made to that idea by central bankers and by monetary economists basically came out to where we are today, which is inflation targeting, or frameworks for monetary policy in which the policymaker says, here's what we're trying to do. And that gives outsiders the capacity to judge how well they're doing that.
Yeah, one of his famous lines that you bring out many times is he wants to replace the Fed with a computer that could do that job. Right. But it's not just that Friedman was from the outside producing these theories with Schwartz and others, but he had personal relationships with many Fed chairmen. I mean, one of the parts of your book that I found the most emotionally effective was his relationship with Arthur Burns, who had become a sort of, as you tell it, a sort of father figure to Friedman in several ways. Can you talk about his relationship with Burns, how that sort of got Friedman intensely involved with the Fed, and how that started sort of this long-running correspondence with later Fed chairs, but also just start with his relationship with Burns and why that was so emotionally affecting.
Yeah, so it's a really fascinating story. He met Burns when he was a young man, probably his late teens, early 20s, when he was an undergraduate at Rutgers. And Burns was an instructor for his economics classes. And Burns was actually not that much older than Friedman, but because they met as student and teacher, they had this kind of mentor-mentee bond. And Friedman lost his father at a young age, towards the end of high school. So you imagine he arrives, it's the Great Depression, he's getting excited about economics as a field that can offer explanations for the sort of social crisis he's seeing around him. He's also a young Jewish man at a moment when opportunity is opening up, but is still quite limited by the fact of being Jewish. And here he gets to college and he sees another young Jewish man who's been very successful as an economist and is now a professional economist. And the two of them really hit it off and had this relationship that Friedman would describe as he was my surrogate father, in that he looked up to him. And as I wrote my book, what I found were these incredible letters that Friedman would send to Burns at sort of every stage of his life. And so when I wanted to know what is Friedman thinking and what is Friedman feeling, I would often go to what is he writing to Arthur Burns, because these letters were kind of like a Dear Diary, very reflective, my hopes and fears. So that relationship continues. They're always helping each other out where they can. Burns is trying to hire Friedman. Friedman is trying to hire Burns. But for most of their life, it's a letter writing or visit a couple times a year relationship. They also do end up spending time in summers together near the New Hampshire-Vermont border. So they connect with each other personally and on a friendship level. So time goes on, and Arthur Burns's career advances, and he's eventually selected by Richard Nixon to be head of the Federal Reserve. And so immediately the newspapers fill with articles, saying, well, we have a monetarist in the Federal Reserve, or the Federal Reserve will now be Friedmanite, or, Friedman is finally at the center of power. And so it seems like a great victory for him. And I see the first letters, Friedman is so happy that Burns is there. And then comes the bombshell. He opens the newspaper and finds that Arthur Burns is supporting what's called incomes policy. Now, incomes policy is a Democratic Party idea. It's not associated with Republicans. And it's basically an effort to use guidelines and political persuasion to convince labor unions not to raise their wages and convince businesses not to raise their prices. It's a way to inhibit inflation. And inflation is starting to run in the early 70s, in part because the Johnson administration is both pursuing an ambitious social agenda and a war in Vietnam, and as a consequence has been pushing for a looser monetary policy. And so now Burns comes in as chair of the Federal Reserve, and instead of saying something like Friedman might expect, like, the Fed will do its best to make sure this inflation doesn't get out of hand, he comes up with a completely different proposal. It's not about monetary policy. And to Friedman, he is convinced that this incomes policy is a first step to wage and price controls. And so, he reads this in the newspaper, and then apparently he goes to sleep, and then he wakes up in the middle of the night and he writes this letter that I describe in the book. And it basically says, Arthur, how could you do this? I am profoundly shocked and betrayed. And what really interested me was that Friedman took this intellectual difference as a real personal difference. And it really threw into question the entire relationship he had. And Arthur Burns was very offended at this criticism and kind of pushed back. And they have a couple letters back and forth. And then Friedman kind of realizes, wait, I'm a critic of the Federal Reserve. My entire public identity is built on a scholar of and a critic of the Federal Reserve. And if I disagree with what Arthur Burns is doing, I have to speak up. I can't just say he's my friend and therefore it's fine, right? So it becomes a question of sort of Friedman's own intellectual integrity. And as it turns out, before long, Burns is advocating wage and price controls, just like Friedman predicted, which, to him is just a complete backwards way to approach inflation. It won't work in addressing the fundamentals. And so there's a series of these really fraught letters, and then they just kind of fizzle out. And, Friedman and Burns do find a way to connect based on their long history, but the relationship is really profoundly changed. And so for me, it was so interesting that, he has this moment that you might think is a moment of triumph for him, but it's on a personal level rather tragic.
It is. And one of the points that I think really brought it home is he wrote this first letter that you described. And then I think it was either the next day or shortly thereafter, before Burns had even responded, he sends off another letter, which is a little bit more personal and nicer, and trying to paper over some of the harshness of his original criticisms, because I think Friedman, realized what you described very well in the book is the depth of this relationship, and perhaps what Friedman wrote in his first letter being negative to that. One of the and this brings me a bit, I think, to the Friedman's personal life, his family, his background. Why was Burns such a surrogate father figure? What happened before Friedman met Burns that sort of set that up and made that possible?
So, I begin by kind of examining his family life. So his parents were immigrants from the area that would now be Russia, sort of Hungary, Eastern Europe. And they arrive, and this is a great wave of immigration, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. They end up settling in a small town of New Jersey. And there's about 10 other families that are Jewish, and in this much larger sort of Anglo-Protestant world. And Friedman from the beginning is just absolutely brilliant. And he loves math, and he decides he'll be an actuary. But the family that he grows up in does not have a great deal of education. They don't have a great deal of social connections. His father is sort of a middleman, arbitrager, buys low, sells high. His mother runs a shop in their town. And so he doesn't really have a vision of where he can go. And so that's why when he meets Burns at Rutgers, and Burns has a graduate degree, has professional work as an economist, and is from the very similar background as Friedman, he becomes just a vision of what he can be. And at that point, Friedman has lost his father. So he's really looking for a mentor, a guide. And his family, while incredibly supportive of his education, his sisters, who all had equally outstanding, if not better, academic records. It was just sort of, well, you're going to work to support the family, and we're going to put the boy through college. And so he had emotional support, he had financial support, but he didn't have a kind of model for his life. And Burns really becomes that. And then Burns is a safe harbor in this discipline that's only beginning to open up to Jewish professionals. And so he knows he can always write to Burns about job questions, interpersonal questions, and feel like Burns is on his side and on his team.
You mentioned the family life of Friedman, and he had sisters, his mother, his father died when Friedman was fairly young. And what's interesting too, of course, is beyond that, the other women in his life who he co-authored with, who he worked with, who influenced his ideas greatly and co-authored them. We mentioned Anna Schwartz already. Of course, his wife, Rose Director Friedman, was a frequent co-author. But why don't you tell us a bit about Anna Schwartz, with whom he co-authored Monetary History of the United States? I mean, how common was it back then for economists who were overwhelmingly male to work with women?
It was very uncommon, especially to have women as co-authors. Now, Schwartz was someone who, a similar background, immigrant background to Friedman, but she grew up in New York City. So she went to Barnard College, and pretty quickly her professors figured out she was brilliant, and she actually started working as a co-author with her professors in college, and then afterwards when she went to graduate school. So she then went to the National Bureau of Economic Research, where she was working under Arthur Burns. And I talk in some detail in the book about the relationship with Burns and Schwartz, which was not positive. And Schwartz had spent a lot of time in Columbia, and she had somehow never gotten a doctorate for all her work. And she had co-authored a 3-volume history on the British economy, but she was still technically a doctoral student. And so then when she was working for the National Bureau of Economic Research, Burns got the idea to put her and Friedman together. And it really was an inspired idea. They were both willing to investigate questions that other economists weren't interested in. They were both incredibly smart, but they had different casts of mind. So Schwartz was willing to go deep into the empirical research, which Friedman was willing to do that. He simply didn't have the time as a tenured professor in Chicago, but this was Schwartz's full-time job. Schwartz also loved history. So as I looked at how they put the monetary history together, it really was Schwartz who went back in time. She wanted to look at the Civil War era and Confederate money because there were all these monetary experiments at the time, and she thought these would be very revealing about the role money plays in economies. And she also was, interested in archival research and pulled out all these stories about the different personalities at the Federal Reserve. So the two of them worked together for 10 years. It was more than 10 years. It was about 12 years. And she would be in New York. He would be in Chicago. They would write letters back and forth. So we have this sort of paper trail of their interactions. And, it's a story I tell in the book, so I won't tell it all here. But eventually Friedman figures out that she still doesn't have a doctorate. And he starts saying to her, mentors, like, why doesn't she have a doctorate? And it's not until a monetary history is on the cusp of publication that Columbia finally decides that Anna Schwartz deserves a doctorate. And of course, the next year the book comes out, and it's really the talk of the town. And they got her the degree just in the nick of time. And so then I talk about her career as it unfolds after that. By the end of her life, she has 9 honorary doctorates. So she really lives through this shift when women economists, there's not a place for them in the discipline other than as sort of a worker bee helping a male economist to where they can be recognized finally as scholars in their own right.
And then you talk about some of his other work with female economists, Dorothy Brady, Margaret Reed. You recount in the book that Friedman even called himself a feminist at one point. Why do you think he was sort of so far ahead of the rest of the profession? Was it the ideas about human capital theory from the University of Chicago? Was it something else? Was it his background? What do you think explains that?
I think part of it is that Friedman lived a life in ideas, in that almost all of his closest relationships were people who shared his interest in economics and often shared his particular more free market economic orientation. So what he saw first about a person really was their ideas, rather than, say, their personality or their sense of humor or also their gender. It kind of washed out for him. Now, of course, he knew these women were women, but he didn't automatically assume, as many of his peers seemed to, that therefore they had nothing interesting to contribute to economics. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that, he's married to a fellow economist, Rose Director, who has a lot of other friends who are also women economists. So he first gets involved in consumption research because one of them is writing a paper with Rose and they're corresponding back and forth. And he kind of grabs the letter and says, well, here's what I think. And it launches them on this, really decades-long conversation, much of which happens in their social time. So again, because Friedman is so sort of focused on his interests, when, Rose's friends come to New Hampshire, to Vermont, where they have their second home, they're all economists, and their idea of a good time is to stay up late talking economics. So out of these conversations come what he eventually publishes as a theory of the consumption function. When I started my research, I had no idea about these other women. Sure, I knew about Rose Friedman, couldn't miss Anna Schwartz. And then I found these letters where he's really working out some of his biggest ideas in these letters. And so one woman is Dorothy Brady, and she has a very close personal relationship with a couple. I talk about how they have a very a lost pregnancy, actually a stillbirth. It's very difficult for them, and Dorothy becomes their main support during this time. And then she connects them to Margaret Reed, who eventually is up for a position at Chicago. And as she's potentially becoming Friedman's colleague, he decides to take these conversations they've been having and to write them up in a memo to convince his colleagues that they should hire Margaret Reed. He would also like them to hire Dorothy Brady. So eventually Margaret Reed is hired. Brady gets like a 1 or 2 year position. And then from there, they move, the project moves forward. So, there's one last facet of his interest and his connection with women economists, and that goes to the way Friedman was always interested in approaches to economic life, approaches to economic analysis that were established, and was much slower than the rest of his colleagues to say, now that economics is becoming more quantitative and mathematical and model-driven, we can sort of set aside all the other work that's been done. And typically, women economists worked on consumption. They were figuring out who bought and sold what. They were deeply empirical, adding up. How many yams did this household buy? What did they pay for a funeral? Do they have a lodger, a boarder? So they were immersed in this sort of empirical research that most economists of Friedman's status had decided was sort of old news. But Friedman was like, well, I still think there's something there. And so it also came from his sort of intellectual orientation that made him more receptive to the expertise these women had, rather than assuming that was kind of yesterday's news and the future of economics was purely model-driven or mathematical.
And theory of the consumption function was essential for him winning the Nobel Prize, right? It was one of the papers that was cited foremost to justify giving him the prize, right?
Yes, and it comes before a monetary history. So as I was describing Friedman's, rise to fame, the monetary history is really what does it for a broader audience. For economists, what really helps restore his reputation is this theory of the consumption function, because he ties it to several key concepts in Keynesian economics about so the consumption function helps you understand how government stimulus spending or the multiplier will affect consumption decisions. And so Friedman provides an alternate way of thinking about this question that's really at the heart of the discipline. And so unlike money, where he's kind of coming in from left field, with consumption, he's sort of stepping into a live conversation. And you have economists who really disagree with Friedman and actually personally dislike him, saying we have to reckon with this book, and everyone is going to have to reckon with this book from now on. So that's an important publication for him within the field of economics.
We've briefly mentioned his wife so far, Rose Director Friedman, who was an accomplished economist in her own right. She stopped short of her PhD, although later she got an honorary PhD. But it's really impossible, I think, to tell the story of Milton Friedman without telling the story of his wife, who was a co-author. They're really like a dynamic duo over time. How did Friedman or how did Milton and Rose meet?
So they both were at the University of Chicago. They both joined the economics department in 1932. And let me just pause right there, because that's unusual for a woman to be in an economics department in 1932 pursuing her PhD is quite unusual. One part of it is that Chicago was more open to women than maybe other top universities were. A second is that she had an older brother who had gone to Chicago and who convinced his parents to let her come to Chicago as an undergraduate, and then he was continuing on for the PhD, and he convinced her to continue on to the PhD. So she had an introduction to the department. So Friedman arrives, and he's kind of brand new. He doesn't know anybody. Rose, director, has technically just begun her PhD program, but she already knows the professors. She knows the students. She's been around the department. So she's very comfortable there. And her last name is Director, and Friedman's last name is Friedman, and they're seated alphabetically. So it's very prosaic in the beginning. He's seated near her in class. And of course, you can imagine this is the one woman in the class, surrounded by young men. So getting her attention is not an easy task. And it will take a couple years before they go from a friendship to actually becoming a couple. And then the mores of the time really mean that there's only room for one career in a married couple. And specifically, most universities have rules where if they hire the husband, they cannot hire the wife in any paid position whatsoever because it would be considered nepotism. And so if the husband in the couple is going to be an economist, almost by definition, the woman cannot be a professional economist. So there are a lot of structural reasons she doesn't pursue her degree. She also, from what she says, felt that she would rather devote her time to her family than to pursuing, her professional path. So it comes to pass that Friedman is married to, a sort of peer equivalent economist. And so he always has someone interested in his work, talking about what he has to do, and also someone who's more interested in how his ideas can be taken to a broader audience. So what Rose Friedman really does is sort of provide the motor behind his emergence as a public intellectual. She's the one who puts together Capitalism and Freedom. It takes raw material that Milton has and kind of sews it all together and makes it something coherent. She convinces him to do the Newsweek column that's incredibly influential. And then later she's a co-producer on Free to Choose, their PBS TV series, and then with him co-authors the book that comes out. So she's really indispensable to the public Milton Friedman, as well as doing the basic work of keeping the family going while he's, immersed in economics in his every waking moment.
It certainly becomes obvious reading your book that his most major public works, Free to Choose, Capitalism and Freedom, the great series, just would not have happened without her work. Something else that comes across, though, in the book is how intensely private they appear to be. I mean, I think you mentioned in there that Rose burned a lot of their correspondence.
Yes.
That must have made your job...
biographer's curse.
Yeah, that must have made your job very difficult.
Yes, for sure. On the other hand, it might have been more material than even I could manage. But it was interesting because, yes, if you read Two Lucky People, which is the memoir they wrote, they quote at length from their letters. And so when I started the project, I was like, great, I would love to see these letters. And, I was told they'd been destroyed. And I asked both her children, and they said that, that sounds like something she would do. So I had to find other ways. So that's why these letters to Arthur Burns are so valuable, because it's actually the letters between Rose and Milton would really only have captured their early courtship years, where the letters to Burns kind of capture the whole arc of his career. And then in some cases, I wasn't really able to say exactly how did she influence the writing of Capitalism and Freedom, because I wasn't able to find any drafts of the book or really any correspondence with the publisher about it. And that was very curious to me, and that makes me think that probably Rose Friedman was worried someone like me would come along and just decided to kind of pull that more personal material out of the archive. And so I guess I can understand her point of view, and every biography has its challenges, and you never have all the sources you want. But I did my best to kind of show their family life, although I was restricted in what I could really document.
How was their family life?
So apparently it resembled an economics seminar in many ways. Just nonstop argument and debate. They had a code for apologizing. I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was number 2 meant I was wrong and you were right. And so the fact that they had these kind of numerical symbols, I think is really interesting and really telling. And so, it was a really close family, but it was, I think, driven by argument and debate, sort of at its core. And I learned that Milton was a very laissez-faire parent, as you might imagine.
Yes.
Would say to the kids on Halloween, you go ahead, eat as much candy as you want. And then I think apparently after a while he was like, okay, no, I need to take some of the candy away. But he tended to be more lax, and Rose tended to be more of the sort of disciplinarian and enforcer. But they lived in the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. They were in this academic enclave, and it wasn't until the children were, towards the end of their childhood and launching that they realized, Dad's really famous. They kind of, that didn't shadow over their childhood, which I think was probably a good thing.
You mentioned their memoir titled Two Lucky People. Now, I must admit, as somebody who's read a lot of work by Friedman, I was always sort of baffled by the title of that book, because so much of Friedman's work, both the popular work and a lot of the academic work, focuses on human behavior affected by incentives, and how a lot of individual initiative responding to incentives is what guides a lot of achievement and social advancement and economic advancement. But then you have the title of their memoirs, and it's luck plays a huge role. What do you think explains that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think there's two aspects to it. One is they're looking back at sort of the scope of their life, and it's been a very successful life, and they're wanting to be modest, and they're wanting to be grateful, and they're recognizing, had they been born in a different place, none of this would have happened. So the villages that they came from turned out to be, stops on the way to Auschwitz, and they know they would not be alive if they hadn't come to the United States. So part of it is kind of a reflection of that. There is a theme especially in his early work, that I try to pull out, and it's pretty much muted by the time he's famous, although you're pointing out it comes back. It's not just all about incentives, and he's aware that, in a capitalist system, it's not a simple matter of you get what you deserve, because he's aware that people have different endowments and people start from different places. And so one of his major policy ideas that I talk about throughout his life is his first idea he advocates for is a minimum income, what we today talk about as a universal basic income. And that's because he just recognizes there are some people who, through fate or fortune, or at a moment in time, are not going to be able to compete in this incentive-driven market economy. And so therefore what a government should do is provide a basic sustenance, a basic income that people can always rely upon. So he is aware that luck does play a huge role in this. And especially in the early part of his career, he's really setting himself up in opposition to particularly American conservatives, some American business conservatives who are taking much more, we would call like a social Darwinist line. Like, we shouldn't provide any support whatsoever. And, unemployment support or this or that will ruin incentives, and, people should just sort of take what's coming to them. And he's always opposed to that from the very beginning, both on, I think, humanitarian and ethical reasons, and also because he believes that that's not good economic policy, that you need to have some resilience and some supports, because capitalism is a dynamic, evolving system.
And riffing off or continuing on the luck theme here, one of the more unlucky moments, partially due to his own actions and others, but also unlucky, was when he went to Chile. And, at that time, Chile was ruled by the dictator Augusto Pinochet. Friedman went there to give a series of lectures down there and actually met with Pinochet. Can you talk about that and the controversy and how that sort of put a pall over his Nobel Prize?
Yeah, I think that was one of the more difficult moments for Friedman. And so I should just start by saying he believed there was going to visit a country, going to advise its government, did not mean endorsing that government. And he had gone to many different places, from communist China to Yugoslavia to Chile. And so he saw this as just another thing. If you're an expert in the macroeconomy, particularly you're an expert in inflation, it makes a lot of sense that a country that, I think when he came there, it was 300% annualized inflation, down from 600% under Allende. So this was a pervasive inflationary situation. And it just made sense to him. Okay, I'm being asked to come and give my advice on how to, make this inflation go away, basically. And the other thing is that, so knowing that, I think it's really important, and it's been interpreted as, oh, Friedman went to talk with Pinochet because he thought he was a great guy. And that's really not the case at all. And so then the other piece that is kind of out there is this idea that Friedman's ideas inspired Pinochet, or inspired the coup, or inspired that. And it really actually happens that the economy is doing so poorly, and it's about a year into Pinochet's regime, that they decide, we have such big problems, mainly this 300% inflation. We have to do something new. So a new group of economists come to the fore, and they invite Friedman to sort of explain what they're doing to both to the inner structure of the regime and to the broader Chilean public. And so that's the context in which he comes. But what happens next is that Pinochet launches an assassination campaign, and he actually assassinates a former member of the Allende regime on the streets of Washington, D.C. So it's a terrible crime. And then just a few weeks later, the Nobel Prize Committee gives the prize to Friedman. And so the combination of those two coming together, it looks like this sort of thinking people of the world are okay with Pinochet and have sort of endorsed him by endorsing Friedman. And I think that's an overinterpretation, but nonetheless, I can see how that happens given how destructive the Pinochet regime is. So Friedman doesn't see this at all. He really has no idea. This is coming, and he's sort of dogged by controversy in his public appearances from then on. And he could never really understand it because, again, he's like, I've been to these other places. I wasn't endorsing the regime when I went there. And what I think is it's this transitional moment where human rights are kind of emerging as a broad popular concern. And Friedman has very much the economist kind of technocratic orientation, like I'm a problem solver and a fixer and I'll go where I'm needed. And there's another set of ideas coming out, which is a sort of politics of purity, and that any engagement is tantamount to endorsement, and the way to really telegraph your moral standing is to not engage in anything that might be morally odious. And this is just not the perspective that Friedman takes, particularly in a situation where he feels like he has something to say about inflation. So it's a difficult aftermath for him, and I would say over time, he would eventually, he tells Pinochet, if you liberalize the economy, eventually you're going to have to liberalize politically. And that is, in fact, what happens in Chile. And I think by the end of his life, he views that that whole trajectory is ultimately ending in a positive place.
That is the great irony of this whole episode, is the public speeches, many of them that he gave while he was in Chile, which was just for less than a week. Many of them were about how economic freedom and liberalization will lead to political freedom. And even in his only 45-minute meeting with Pinochet, he brought that up, as you recount, which is quite a gutsy move, I think, to bring up to a dictator. But, you know, if I were to summarize Friedman's thoughts about politics, about economics, I think just the phrase capitalism and freedom is probably the simplest explanation. He changed his mind a little bit. He went a little back and forth about capitalism and free markets leading to political freedom and social freedom, and different times in his life sort of thought about maybe there's a tension between democracy and freedom. Can you describe some of his thoughts about this and where he really sort of ended up by the time he got older?
Yeah, I think, and part of the story is when he wrote Capitalism and Freedom, he was addressing an American audience, and he is, his whole life been a professor in American academia, and he felt he really needed to emphasize economic freedom, that in the 60s, there was not, the economic side of freedom in the United States was not fully appreciated. He really wanted to push that forward. So in the aftermath of Chile, he sort of realizes, I've been talking so much about economic freedom, maybe people haven't realized that political freedom also matters to me. So he starts to recalibrate a little bit and realize that you need both sort of working together. You can't just have economic freedom, because if you don't have political freedom, eventually the state will take over the economic processes. So that's kind of one modification. The other comes towards the end of his life as he's observing events in Asia. Now, when it comes to China, he remains convinced that China is somewhere on the trajectory that Chile took. He thinks there'll be more Tiananmen squares. He thinks there'll be more protest. And he thinks that eventually the Chinese Communist government will fall just as the USSR fell. But what catches his eye are, we might call the Asian tigers or the Asian city-states, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, that are economically very prosperous, but limit political freedom in significant ways. And so he ends up deciding that maybe there's something called civic freedom, which to him is the ability to gather. And so it's not a totalitarian regime. In other words, you don't have a Stasi or a secret police keeping track of you, but you still can't vote. So you really don't have a choice of your political system, but you have some limited freedom, civic and economic. So by the end of his life, he's realizing it's more complicated. And I would say the simplicity of Capitalism and Freedom has a lot to do with the simplicity of the world, such that it was when you had, a bipolar world, roughly, United States representing capitalism and its allies, Russia and its allies representing communism or a planned economy. It was easier to kind of make these syllogistic claims. After the Cold War, you just see a proliferation of different forms of governance and market economies. And so he's trying to sort of adjust what he has to say in the closing years of his life.
I mean, one of the interesting things is, being ahead of a lot of these intellectual trends that we've talked about, being ahead of social trends that Friedman is he was always a fierce critic of communism. But that wasn't unusual. But what was unusual is that so many other folks like John Kenneth Galbraith, economist Paul Samuelson, others thought that the Soviet Union was doing fairly well economically. And Friedman sort of always maintained that they were kind of a basket case economy. Why do you think Friedman was so, right about that, ahead of his time about that, while so many of these other well-known economists were wrong? I mean, Samuelson, in his textbooks, which everybody had to read, the dominant economics textbooks, it talked about Soviet economic growth converging with that of the United States over time. Like, what did Friedman see that so many of these other brilliant economists missed?
Well, I think some of it goes back to his interest in empirical studies. So he had a couple of students who were working on the Soviet economy, and so he was paying a little bit more attention to sort of what you could measure that was not in the official statistics or what was reported. So I think part of it is not just assuming that you have a model of how economies develop, but actually questioning what's there underneath. And then I think part of it is just his very strong belief that economic growth comes from this sort of aggregate of myriad individual decisions, and that people have to be free to make individual decisions, have individual initiative. And if that was being snuffed out in the Soviet Union, that they simply would not be able to compete. Now, part of this analysis is drawing on the work and ideas of F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, who basically say you can't really have a price system in a planned economy. And if you don't have a price system, people don't have the information they need in order to make good decisions economically. So you're just kind of closing everybody's eyes, and there's no way an economy will be able to function in that way. So, he's always very ethically opposed to the idea of a planned economy, and he just thinks there's not really any evidence that it will work. And so he's just very suspicious of the claims that it will, also because he has no reason to want to believe this, because he does not want more economic planning in the United States. And so some of the more credulous economists may be credulous because they think it will strengthen their hand in the policy debates within the United States. And that's not meaningful for Friedman. See,
one of the other things that really struck me in your book is you have a few quotes from modern politicians like, President Joe Biden. When he was running. One of them is, quote, and he said, and Joe Biden said this during the 2020 campaign, Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore. And then in another occasion, Biden said, when did Milton Friedman die and become king? And I thought these quotes were extraordinary, as they were stated, over a decade after Friedman had passed away. I mean, why is Friedman just so important nowadays, even still, that presidential candidates during campaigns in 2020 are talking about him and his ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I found those quotes fascinating as well. I mean, that's one reason I wanted to write this book, because Friedman is one of those few economists that becomes kind of a touchstone after his death, and just in politics and in our thinking about society more broadly. So I think what that really points to is the way in which Friedman's ideas, although he started off, very closely allied with a movement that called itself conservative, with conservative politicians, Republican politicians, his ideas about the importance of market incentives, about the benefits from reducing the size of government, focusing on monetary policy, these kind of flowed out of where they started and became really pervasive in the general thinking of people on the left, right, and center. And it can't all be laid at Friedman's feet. And one thing I try to do in the book is show these bigger shifts in economic structures across the world. In the 1970s, inflation has enormous consequences in many different ways. The fall of the Soviet Union has enormous consequences. So Friedman's ideas don't cause these, but they help us interpret and understand them. So when I look at that Biden quote, what that says to me is you might read it at first blush and say this is Biden criticizing Republican economic policy, but it's also Biden criticizing people within the Democratic Party who might be more friendly to Friedman-style ideas, and it's really kind of planting a flag of allegiance to a more progressive economic outlook. And so that quote tells you how important Friedman is to kind of intramural Democratic Party politics, as well as being a representative of a sort of consensus Republican view that has been very dominant, I would say, until recently. So that just shows you that Friedman has become definitely larger than life and a symbol of, everything that the United States has experienced over the past 50 years, really.
Yeah, he definitely has become a symbol. Friedman was a scholar, a public intellectual, a policy advisor to presidents and governments around the world. He was a brilliant communicator. You watch his TV appearances on Phil Donahue or on PBS or in the Free to Choose series, and the ideas are so clear and well communicated. And of course, a big supporter of free markets and capitalism. Is there anybody like him alive today who has all of those skills wrapped up into one?
Yeah, I don't think there is, and I think there's sort of two reasons. One is, there are economists who do great work popularizing economic ideas who are known outside of their discipline. So there's kind of a lane that Friedman created for public intellectual economists. But few of those also have the connections to policymakers, and few of them have the breadth and depth of economic thinking that Friedman had. And I think there's kind of two reasons for this. One is what we talked about earlier in the conversation. Friedman is not just Friedman. He has a number of women collaborators who, because of the mores of their day, cannot be independent intellectuals. And so they pour their intellectual energy and their gifts and their strengths into Milton Friedman. And he tremendously benefits from that. So that wouldn't happen today. Margaret Reed today would be elevated in her own right and given full support of her colleagues, given a workshop, be training her own students. And she lives in a world where she has to give her ideas to Friedman for them to go anywhere. And then I also think it's just the media landscape. Friedman's on YouTube. He'd be great on YouTube if he were alive. He'd probably have a mean Substack. But there's nothing like a Newsweek column today. It really was the era of big media when you had a few networks, you had a few magazines that, educated people read. And we're just in a much more fragmented media landscape. I think it's much harder for one person to emerge as a sort of symbolic figurehead. The last thing I will say is that Friedman became allied with a conservative movement that was sort of growing under the surface for a while and then burst more into prominence and was looking for people who could carry the message broader. And so he really stood on the top of other conservatives who saw him as a good spokesperson. And so we have so much political flux today. I think it's harder for an intellectual to stand on top of a coherent, evolving and growing political movement. That maybe it will happen. I'll definitely be watching. It could happen in the next coming years.
So there's one last question that I want to ask you. The subtitle of your book, it's Milton Friedman. The subtitle is The Last Conservative. It was surprising to me when I received the book in the mail. Frankly, I've never really thought of Friedman as a conservative. He often described himself as a liberal or classical liberal. He said he was a small L libertarian, so not affiliated with the Libertarian Party, but a sort of ideological libertarian at times. He said he was a Republican at different times. He said he was a radical. But I never got the sense conservative. Why did you choose that subtitle, The Last Conservative, both the last part and the conservative part?
There's a couple different reasons I did, and I'm very aware that Friedman did not call himself a conservative and would probably not like the title of the book. He didn't go so far as F.A. Hayek did to write an essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative. And maybe if he had written that essay, I would say I can't move forward with this title. But I kind of mean it in two ways. One is when you look at his the people he interacted with, the people he gave his ideas to within American politics, those who found him most compelling, most of those people called themselves conservatives. And conservatism in the United States is different than conservatism in other countries, in large part because it incorporates what in other countries is called liberalism or neoliberalism, a celebration of the market. And celebrating capitalism, which is a dynamic economic system, is in some ways in tension with being conservative because it drives a lot of social change. Nonetheless, in the United States, you have this sort of hybrid political movement of people who are socially or religiously conservative, with economists dedicated to the free market, during the Cold War era, people who felt very strongly Soviet Russia needed to be combated. These people come together, they call themselves conservative, they're called by others conservative, and Friedman is part of this movement. So that's just sort of empirically a reason to call him that. The other way that is maybe even more substantive came from understanding his approach as an economist, which was to look at ideas, traditions, and approaches that had defined the discipline that were really being left behind in the post-war era, and to say, hold on a second, there's something here worth conserving. And so I do see him as someone who conserves the kind of inherited wisdom of his discipline. So monetarism is based on the quantity theory of money, an older idea that most economists in the 50s said, it's not really relevant anymore. Likewise, the very practice of doing empirical historical research was very out of fashion. And so I think that was his intellectual orientation. I think within American society, it was his political orientation. In terms of the last, that's really gesturing a little bit to the current state of affairs where conservatism is very much in flux and I think contested and up for grabs. And the type of conservatism that Friedman represented, that synthesis of free market capitalism, religious traditionalism, and an aggressive foreign policy and a sort of orientation to global markets and to global influence, that synthesis, the pieces are all there, but they don't come together in the same coherent way they did when Friedman was at the height of his influence. So I think it's sort of a provocation and sort of an invitation. We don't know if he's the last conservative or not. It might look like that right now. For some people, that will be cause for celebration. For others, cause for loss. But, the book is not yet written. So with my book, I want to give people resources to think about kind of how we got here and to think what in our past do we want to carry with us into the future?
Well, thank you very much, Professor Burns. It certainly was a provoking title. It certainly provoked me. But the book is really wonderful. It's well written. It's thorough. It gives insights into his life that I had no idea of. And the book, again, is Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.